We're counting down the 25 survival meals pioneer families ate crossing the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail. Foods that carried them from Independence, Missouri, to the Willamette Valley across 6 months of dust, river crossings, and hunger. From bread so hard it broke teeth to feasts pulled from a single buffalo, each entry tells the story of endurance, improvisation, and the strange creativity of people cooking over burning dung on an open prairie. Expect meals your family would refuse today, prices that will stun you, and flavors born from having absolutely no other choice. Which trail food tops the list? Let's begin our countdown with number 25. Number 25. Hardtack, called pilot bread by the men who packed it, was the plainest thing in the wagon and the most reliable. Flour, water, and salt, baked until every trace of moisture was driven out, then baked again. The result was a pale cracker roughly 3 inches square that would not spoil, would not mold, and would not soften for anything short of hot coffee. Families bought it by the barrel in Independence for a few cents a pound, and it sat in the wagon box for months without complaint. Emigrants learned to break it with a rifle butt or soak it overnight in water until it swelled into something a child could chew. Diaries recall weevils in the crumbs and mothers deciding quietly that nobody needed to know. Hardtack was not food you looked forward to. It was food that was still there when everything else was gone. Number 24. Cornmeal mush anchored the morning fire when flour ran low and the day started before sunrise. The cook stirred coarse ground meal into a kettle of boiling water with a pinch of salt and let it thicken over buffalo chips until a spoon would stand up in it. It cost almost nothing. Cornmeal sold at outfitting posts for roughly 1.5 cents a pound in the early 1850s, and a family could carry 100 pounds of it without noticing the weight against a wagon already loaded to 1,800. Poured hot into tin plates and eaten with a smear of molasses or a pat of trail butter, it filled a stomach for a solid morning of walking. Leftovers were pressed into a pan overnight, sliced cold at noon, and fried in pork grease. Children remembered the wooden spoon knocking the kettle before dawn as the true beginning of every trail day. Number 23. Salt pork and flour. Gravy carried more emigrants across the plains than any hunter ever did. The pork came out of the barrel gray and stiff with salt, and the first job was soaking it, sometimes overnight, in creek water to make it fit to eat at all. Then it hit a hot skillet and rendered out a shallow pool of fat, which was the entire point. Into that fat went 2 spoonfuls of flour, stirred until it browned, then water or milk if a cow walked behind the wagon. What came out was thick, salty, and pale, and it was poured over hardtack, biscuits, or plain boiled potatoes. Nobody praised the taste. Everybody ate it twice a day. Number 22. Green coffee. Roasted at dawn was the one luxury nobody would surrender. Coffee traveled as raw green beans, hard as gravel, because roasted coffee went stale and ground coffee went stale faster. So every morning somebody shook a skillet over the fire until the beans cracked and darkened, and the whole camp smelled like a town again. Then it was crushed in a mortar, or wrapped in cloth and beaten with a hammer, and boiled hard in a blackened pot with an eggshell, or a splash of cold water thrown in to settle the grounds. Outfitting lists recommended 10 pounds per adult for the crossing. It sold for 8 to 10 cents a pound in Independence and 3 times that at Fort Laramie, where emigrants paid without arguing. Diaries record families abandoning furniture and heirloom trunks beside the trail to lighten the load, and keeping the coffee. It was hot, it was bitter, it made bad water drinkable, and it told everyone the day had started. Number 21. Dried apples were the small sweetness that kept an entire wagon company from turning on each other. Sliced thin and dried on racks the previous autumn back in Ohio or Illinois, they went into sacks that weighed nothing and lasted forever. On the trail, they were soaked in a covered kettle overnight until they swelled back into something like fruit, then stewed with sugar into a sauce or folded into a Dutch oven pie with a crust of flour and pork fat. Mothers rationed them out by the handful on Sundays and birthdays. Children chewed them dry, straight from the sack, when nobody was looking. Dried fruit was cheap, light, and reliable, and it was also the only thing on the plains that tasted like home. Number 20. Rice with dried fruit turned a plain kettle into something close to dessert. Rice traveled beautifully. It did not spoil, it did not draw weevils the way flour did, and it swelled to 3 times its dry volume, which meant a cook could feed 6 people from 1.5 pounds. Emigrant guides recommended 20 pounds per adult, and it sold for around 4 cents a pound at the jumping-off towns. Simmered slow with water and a spoon of sugar, then stirred through with soaked dried apples or peaches and a dusting of cinnamon. If the family had thought to pack any, it landed in tin plates, warm, sticky, and sweet. Diaries describe children scraping the browned crust from the bottom of the kettle, the prize worth fighting over. In a life measured out in salt pork and bad water, sweetened rice at the end of a 20-mile day was close to a celebration. Number 19. Navy beans simmered all day in a kettle, slung under the wagon while the family walked beside it. This was the trick that separated an experienced outfit from a green one. Beans need hours, and hours were the one thing the trail refused to give a cook standing still, so the cook stopped giving them. The beans went in at breakfast with water and a chunk of salt pork. The lid was tied down, and the kettle rode the jolting axle all afternoon, still warm from the morning fire, softening as the miles passed. By evening, the pot only needed 20 minutes over fresh chips to finish. Beans cost about 3 cents a pound and delivered protein that walked, which mattered enormously on a route where a hunter might come back empty for a week. Served thick with cornbread and pork fat, they were the closest thing the trail had to a proper supper. Number 18. Saleratus biscuits used a leavening agent the emigrants picked up off the ground, free, in the middle of Wyoming. Along the Sweetwater, near the alkali flats and the shallow lakes past Independence Rock, the earth crusted over with a white powder that was very close to the baking soda families had paid good money for back east. Wagon trains stopped, and women scraped it into sacks with tin cups. Diaries from 1849 and 1850 describe emigrants gathering enough in an hour to leaven bread for the rest of the crossing. Mixed carefully into flour with a splash of sour milk to activate it, it produced biscuits that rose light and golden in a Dutch oven buried in coals. Too much, and the bread turned soapy and yellow, and nobody would touch it. Too little, and it came out like a brick. It took judgment, and the women who had it were spoken of with real respect. Number 17. Ash cake, sometimes called Johnny cake or hoe cake depending on which state the family came from, was bread made when there was no oven, no skillet free, and no patience left. The cook mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt into a stiff dough, patted it into a flat round the size of a plate, and laid it directly onto the swept hearth of the fire, then raked hot ashes over the top. 20 minutes later, she pulled it out, knocked the ash off with the back of a knife, and broke it into pieces. It was gritty at the edges. Nobody cared. This was the oldest trick in the American frontier kitchen, carried west from Kentucky and Tennessee cabins by families who had been making it for generations. It required no equipment at all, which meant it still worked after the wagon had been lightened for the 3rd time, and half the cookware lay beside the trail. Number 16. Dried pumpkin rings and vegetables hung in the wagon like strange decorations, and quietly kept people alive. Before leaving, families spent the autumn slicing pumpkin into rings, stringing beans into what they called leather breeches, and drying corn on the cob until the kernels went hard as beads. All of it hung from the wagon bows, swaying above the flour barrels for 2,000 miles. On the trail, it was soaked and boiled back into a soft, sweet, slightly leathery vegetable that broke up the endless run of pork and bread. Nobody in 1850 could have told you about vitamin C, but every experienced mother knew that outfits eating nothing but meat and flour got sick, and outfits eating something green did not. The dried vegetables cost almost no weight and no money. What they bought was the difference between arriving in Oregon healthy and arriving barely. Number 15, molasses on hardtack was what passed for candy between Missouri and the Columbia. A jug of sorghum, or blackstrap molasses, cost around 25 cents a gallon in Missouri, and families packed it because it was the cheapest sweetness that would survive the journey. Sugar was expensive and drew moisture. Molasses just sat there, thick and dark and patient. Children were given a cracker with a spoonful poured over it, and diaries described them making it last a mile of walking. It went into coffee when sugar ran out, over cornmeal mush at breakfast, into gingerbread when a mother felt generous and the flour barrel allowed. It also blackened tin cups and glued shut every jar it touched, and it dripped down wagon boxes in the summer heat until the wood turned sticky. But on a route where every meal tasted of salt and grease, a spoonful of something sweet was worth carrying a heavy jug for. Number 14. Wagon-churned butter is the trail's most famous piece of accidental engineering, and it worked exactly as the stories say. A family with a milk cow tied behind the wagon milked her at dawn, strained the milk into a covered churn or a tightly lidded pail, and hung it from the wagon bow. Then the trail did the rest. 10 hours of ruts, rocks, and river fords slammed that pail around all day, and by evening the cream had broken into a lump of pale, yellow butter floating in buttermilk. The cook drained it, worked it with a wooden paddle, salted it, and set it out for supper biscuits. The buttermilk went into bread or straight down a child's throat. Emigrant diaries mention it with genuine delight because it was the one thing on the entire crossing that got made without anybody having to do a single bit of extra work. Number 13. Vinegar pie was an invention born of desperation, and it fooled people who should have known better. 2,000 miles from a lemon tree, a woman who wanted to make something special for a wedding on the trail, or a child's birthday reached for what she had: flour, sugar, water, a spoonful of vinegar, and if she was lucky, an egg. Cooked down into a filling and baked in a Dutch oven crust, the vinegar's sharpness read on the tongue as citrus. People who had eaten real lemon pie said it was close. Sometimes the cook browned the flour first for a caramel note, or grated in a scrap of nutmeg saved from home. It cost almost nothing, and it existed for one reason only, which was to prove that a family crossing a continent in a canvas box could still make a thing that was purely for joy. That is why it survives in cookbooks, and the trail's plainer foods do not. Number 12. Wild greens and sheep sorrel were foraged along creek bottoms by children sent out with a sack while the oxen were unhitched. Lamb's quarter, wild onion, watercress in the clear water above the alkali, sorrel with its sharp lemon bite. Mothers boiled them briefly with a scrap of pork and served them alongside the evening bread, and the sharp green taste was startling after weeks of grease. This was not a treat. It was medicine, and the smart trains treated it that way. Scurvy stalked the Oregon Trail, particularly in the gold rush years, when men outfitted fast, packed nothing but bacon and flour, and started losing teeth somewhere in Idaho. Emigrant guides specifically warned against a meat and bread diet and told families to gather what grew. The women who insisted over the complaints of children who wanted to be doing anything else are a quiet reason some outfits reach the Willamette intact. Number 11. Chokecherries, service berries, and currants marked the calendar for anyone paying attention. Along the Platte and later in the high country toward Fort Hall, the bushes came in through midsummer just as the wagons passed, and a train would halt for an afternoon so everybody could pick. Service berries were sweet enough to eat by the handful. Currants went into pies. Chokecherries, true to the name, dried the mouth out so violently that children learned exactly once. But boiled with sugar and strained, they made a dark jelly and pounded whole, stones and all. They went into pemmican the way the Plains nations had done for centuries. Diaries, record buckets filled in an hour, and hands stained purple for days. It was free food in a landscape where families were paying $1 a pound for flour at the forts, and for one afternoon the crossing felt less like an ordeal and more like a summer. Number 10. Sage hen stew came from the birds that exploded out of the brush under the oxen's feet through the whole sagebrush country of Wyoming and Idaho. Sage grouse are big birds, 5 or 6 pounds, and slow enough that a boy with a shotgun could bring back 2 or 3 before supper. The meat was dark and strong, and tasted powerfully of the sage the bird had spent its life eating, which some emigrants loved and others could barely swallow. The fix was long, slow stewing with onions, if there were any, and potatoes or rice, until the sharpness mellowed into something rich. Diaries from the 1852 season mention sage hens turning up on nights when the hunters had failed at everything else. It was not the meat anybody wanted. It was the meat that showed up in a stretch of trail where the land offered almost nothing else, and families were grateful. Number 9. Antelope and elk were the reward for good shooting, and they changed a camp's mood instantly. Pronghorn ran the high plains in numbers that stunned emigrants who had grown up in settled Ohio farmland, and a single antelope could give a wagon company 60 or 70 pounds of lean, sweet meat. The problem was that pronghorn are among the fastest animals on the continent and enormously hard to approach. Elk were bigger and better eating, but scarcer along the main route. When a kill came in, the whole train worked. Steaks went straight onto green willow sticks over the fire. The rest was sliced thin within the hour and hung on ropes to dry, because meat that sat overnight in July heat was meat wasted. Diaries describe the camp staying awake late for once, eating fresh meat until they could not manage another bite, laughing in a way they had not for weeks. Number 8. Trout and traded salmon carried families through the hungriest stretch of the entire route. By the time a wagon train reached the Snake River in Idaho, the buffalo were long behind them, the bacon barrel was low, and the flour was measured in cupfuls. Then they came to Salmon Falls, where the Shoshone had been fishing the runs for generations and stood ready to trade. Emigrants handed over fishhooks, powder, cloth, old shirts and buttons, and received fresh and dried salmon by the armload. Diaries from 1845 through the 1850s mention this trade over and over, sometimes gratefully, sometimes with grumbling about the price. Farther up, mountain streams gave trout to anyone patient with a line. Broiled over willow coals or boiled into chowder with the last of the flour, that fish arrived at precisely the moment families needed it most, and many of them knew it. Number 7. Camas root and traded provisions came from the native nations who had been feeding themselves on this ground for thousands of years and, more often than the old stories admit, fed the emigrants too. Camas bulbs, dug from wet meadows and roasted for days in earth ovens until the starch turned to sugar, came out dark, sweet, and dense, tasting something like a baked pear. Nez Perce and Cayuse families traded them, along with dried salmon, berry cakes, and horses, to wagon trains arriving hollow-eyed at the end of the Snake. Emigrants who tried camas either loved it or found it violently disagreed with them. and diaries record both loudly. But the plain fact underneath the entry is this: in the last 400 miles, when the guidebook math had failed and the barrels were empty, a great many families ate because the people who lived there chose to sell them food. Number 6. Slumgullion was the name given to whatever went into the kettle when nobody was pretending anymore. A handful of rice, the last cup of beans, a scrap of salt pork, 3 wild onions, some jerky pounded soft, a spoon of flour to thicken, and water. Boil it until the ingredients stopped being ingredients. Emigrants used the word with a kind of grim affection, and every trail diary that mentions it does so in the same tone. Nobody could name what was in it. Everybody ate 2 plates. This was cooking as pure arithmetic, the exact opposite of the kitchens these women had left behind in Missouri and Illinois, where a Sunday dinner had a menu and a sequence and a good tablecloth. Out here, supper had one rule, which was that it had to fill 6 people from whatever was left in the wagon. Slumgullion was that rule, boiled. Number 5. Jerky was the trail's insurance policy, and it was made in a hurry on the hottest days of the year. When a hunt came in, the meat had hours before it turned. So the women cut it into strips no thicker than a finger, rubbed them hard with salt, and hung them from ropes strung the length of the wagon, or laid them across the canvas top where the sun hit hardest. Wagons rolled west, trailing meat like laundry, drying as they went, and travelers described the smell reaching them before the train did. 3 days of prairie sun and wind pulled every drop of moisture out, and what was left would keep for months in a sack. It was tough enough to work a jaw for 10 minutes. It was also the difference between a hungry week and a starving one, and children chewed it while walking beside the oxen because there was nothing else until night. Number 4. Pemmican was the most sophisticated food on the Oregon Trail, and no emigrant invented it. Plains nations had been making it for generations, and mountain men and wagon companies adopted it wholesale because nothing else came close. Dried meat was pounded to powder between stones, mixed with an equal weight of rendered fat, and studded with crushed choke cherries or service berries, then packed tight into rawhide bags or a section of gut and sealed. The result, kept for years without spoiling, delivered enormous energy by weight and required no cooking whatsoever. A pound of it did the work of 5 pounds of fresh meat. Emigrants traded for it at Fort Laramie and Fort Hall and packed it for the worst stretches, the desert crossings and the Blue Mountains, where a fire might not be possible and a delay might be fatal. It was survival food engineered by people who understood the country, and the wagons ran on it. Number 3. Desperation. Meat is the part of the trail story that rarely makes the school books. When the provisions ran out, and on a route where roughly 1 in 10 who set out did not finish, they ran out often. Families ate whatever moved. Rattlesnake, skinned and fried, which several diarists insist tasted like chicken, and several others insist did not. Prairie dog, boiled long, because there was almost nothing on the bone. Jackrabbit so lean it left men hungrier than before. And at the end of the line, the ox, the animal that had pulled the wagon for 1,400 miles, that the children had named, that had a personality everyone in the family knew. Going down in the traces from exhaustion and being butchered on the spot because letting that much meat rot was not a decision anybody could afford. Diaries record it flatly, in a single line, which tells you everything about what it cost to write down. Number 2. Bacon packed in bran was the backbone of the crossing, and getting it there intact was a genuine problem. Guidebooks told families to bring 150 pounds of cured pork per adult, roughly a full third of all the food in the wagon. But July on the plains hit 100 degrees inside a canvas cover, and fat renders. So emigrants layered their bacon sides into barrels packed with bran, which absorbed the drip, blocked the light, and held the temperature steady. Some buried the barrels at noon halts. Diaries from 1849 describe opening a barrel in Wyoming to find the bran soaked through and the meat gone rancid, and the silence that followed. When it worked, and it usually did, a slice hit the skillet every morning and every evening for 6 months, and the grease it left behind cooked everything else. Bacon was not a meal. Bacon was the reason there were meals. And finally, in first place, buffalo hump and boudins crowned the Oregon Trail as the meal every emigrant remembered for the rest of their life. Somewhere past Fort Kearny, the herds appeared, and diarists ran out of words trying to describe them, writing about the plain turning black to the horizon and the ground shaking. When the hunters brought one in, the whole train stopped and turned into a butcher shop. The hump ribs came out first, thick and marbled and richer than any beef these farmers had ever raised, roasted over a chip fire until the fat ran and dripped hissing into the coals. Then the boudins, the small intestine, rinsed and roasted whole in the fire and eaten hot from the end like a sausage, a delicacy learned directly from plains hunters and mountain men, which stunned every Eastern family the first time and was requested by them every time after. Emigrants ate until they were sick, and then ate more because they had been walking on salt pork for 300 miles, and their bodies knew what they had been missing. Diaries describe children with fat to their elbows, grease on the canvas, men sleeping where they sat, and the next morning the whole camp cut the rest into strips, hung it on ropes, and rolled west with the meat drying above their heads. It was the one night on 2,000 miles when nobody was hungry. Across all 25 entries, from the hardtack that opened our list to the buffalo feast at the very top, these trail meals tell a story of endurance, improvisation, and people learning to eat a continent they did not understand. Some, like the failing ox and the desperation meat, are the sharpest reminders of what the crossing actually cost. Others, like vinegar pie and a bucket of service berries, show that families still made room for joy in a canvas box the size of a bed. The common thread is that almost nothing came easy, almost nothing was wasted, and the knowledge that got them through often came from the people already living there. These were not recipes. They were the taste of a generation that gambled everything on the far side of the map.